Okay.
And
Also, Dr. Convertino, you might be able to see, I'll send you that, but you'll be able to see attendees as they pop in case you know anybody or want to shout out anybody.
Thank you.
Great.
I'm excited about this one. I can't wait.
Woohoo.
Were you about to ask me something, Sylvia?
No, I was just saying thank you for facilitating this one. I really appreciate you.
Of course.
I want to put back on my glasses, but there's always such a glare.
I know, right? Are you saying that because all you can see is you can see yourselves here? You're like, there's always such a glare. Oh, okay.
And mine is supposed to have that, whatever it is, to make him not have glare, but
That blue screen or whatever, the blue, whatever it's called.
For the anti-glare.
Anti-glare, yeah, anti-glare. I have been drinking coffee all day.
Oh, wow. I haven't had a cup today, actually. I'll probably have a cup to get through the night so I can finish some writing.
I'm not gonna sleep tonight. I think I've had 4 cups in the afternoon.
Oh
you're
my
not gonna be
goodness.
able to sleep tonight.
I'm not. I'll be here, my eyes like this.
I really do love your background, Dr. How do you say your last name? Convertino?
Convertino. Yeah, thank you.
It makes me feel like I'm at a library.
Yeah.
No, and that's a good feeling.
Yeah, it's kind of cozy.
I'm like, oh,
Mhm,
when we could just be at the library.
It's like our special,
mhm.
those of us who wrote our dissertations before the internet, it's our special place.
Mhm, mhm.
The whole feel of a library makes you feel
Yeah,
productive.
that whole like.
Me too. Mhm.
Dr. Acosta, whenever you want to start, it's right at 6 and people will come and go as they're available. So I think if you want to start with the introductions, that's great.
Absolutely. Welcome to everybody to our courageous conversation with YWCA El Paso. As you may or may not realize, the YWCA mission is to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. We started these courageous conversations to create a space for us to have a conversation and to provide some information on topics that we feel sometimes are very controversial and people just may not have access to the information. So as part of this, we've had several courageous conversations. This one is on critical race theory. We know that has been a huge topic throughout the nation, and we felt it was important that you heard from experts in the field, and so that you could better make your own decisions about critical race theory and what that is and how that presents itself in the work that we do as professors, or the work that that happens throughout the community. So before we begin, I need to make a few announcements. The first one is that YWCA is hosting its 15th annual Race Against Racism. It is on Saturday at Ascarate Park. Starts at 8:30. Registration is $25 and you get the coolest shirt ever. It says Eliminate Racism. That's the shirt you want to be wearing around everywhere. And do it for the shirt if you don't want to walk. And it's good for your New Year's resolution. So we hope that you will join us. I will tell you that walk-up registration will be available until 7:30, and online registration closes tonight at midnight. www.ywcaelpaso.org to sign up. So I hope that you will join us. Right now we have over 200 people signed up, so we're very excited about that because it's going to be cold. Just wear a lot of clothes. Just wear a lot of clothes. And so with that, I want to also take a moment to introduce one of our amazing board members who not only sits on the YWCA board and has been a part of the YWCA board for a very long time. She has not only overseen our racial justice committee, but she currently serves on YWCA USA board. She is a professor at the University of Texas at El Paso and is currently and let me tell you in what, it's in liberal arts in the religious studies and women and gender studies. And she is just such an advocate and such a strong believer in making sure that truth leads any conversation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ann Horak. Thank you so much for moderating this, Dr. Horak. We really appreciate you, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia, and welcome everybody. We're really excited to talk to you tonight because we feel like critical race theory is something that has been misunderstood and misrepresented recently in the media, but really it's something that that is a very helpful way of looking at the world. And so we're going to be talking about that. And I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves. As Sylvia said, I'm a professor at UTEP and I teach a course on religion, race, and gender. And that's the course in which my students and I talk about critical race theory the most. But I'm joined by two colleagues from UTEP, and I'm also joined by a brand new colleague at NMSU who will be moving here soon. And so I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves. Let's start with Christina, and then Char, and then Erica. So Dr. Convertino.
Thank you, Anne. Good evening, everybody. I'm Christina Convertino, Dr. Convertino, and I am an associate professor at UTEP in the College of Education and Sociocultural Foundations. I'm also an educational anthropologist, and I have been teaching courses on equity and diversity in education for over 20 years, and I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation this evening.
Thank you. My name is Char Ullman, and I'm also a faculty member in the Department of Teacher Education at UTEP with Dr. Convertino. And I'm also an educational anthropologist, and I'm also in Sociocultural Foundations of Education. And I've been doing this work for a long time as well, and I'm really excited to be here.
Great, thanks.
I am Dr. Erica Reid, and I am new to NMSU. I'm a visiting professor creating Africana Studies minor, so that is very exciting. So if you're at NMSU, yes, the minor is in and it does exist. I'm also teaching the courses, and my background is in multicultural education, specifically teacher education and schools overall. I'm a diehard educator, and it is exciting to have this conversation.
Thank you. We are excited that you're going to be coming to our region, Dr. Reid. We're excited to have you. So I'm going to kind of start us off, and then we're each going to take turns sharing a little bit, going a little deeper into CRT, or critical race theory, and then we're going to take some questions from each of you. We're also going to respond as we're talking to some of the questions that were pre-submitted. And so one of the questions that was pre-submitted is just, what is critical race theory? And that's kind of why we're here today, to talk about it. So let me start with the most basic of what it is. It's a term that was developed by a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw, and she is currently a law professor at UCLA Law School and at Columbia Law School. But when she was at Harvard Law, she was influenced, she and other professors and students were heavily influenced by Derek Bell, who, if you know anything about civil rights and civil justice law, Derek Bell was a longtime icon in the field, a lawyer and a professor at Harvard Law School. And they were looking at what do we do next? You know, with the work that Martin Luther King Jr. had done with the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s. Now it was the 80s and 90s. And it's like, what's the next step? And they were looking at ways in which the law continued to apply unequally. to different members of society for a variety of reasons. But for them, the one they were looking at was race. And this was very much tied to the work that had come before in the civil rights movement. So we just celebrated Martin Luther King Day. And, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. has this powerful line in one of his speeches where he says, all we're asking of America is to be true to what you said on paper, that all men are created equal. Well, Kimberly Crenshaw and her colleagues were seeing that that was still not true. And so they came up with a way of how to look at, in their world, the legal world, the ways in which laws were systematically continuing oppression on the basis of race. Now, Kimberly Crenshaw has spoken a lot recently, as you can imagine, as critical race theory. Suddenly 30 years later, it's been around for over 30 years. Suddenly 30 years later, came back into mainstream media. And an interview that I heard with her yesterday, she said, recently, not yesterday, she said something very helpful. She said, critical race theory isn't a thing. It's a way to look at things. It's a way to look at patterns of structural racism. It's a way to get at the issue that we talk about a lot in the YWCA movement, both in El Paso and nationally. The issue that individual people can be very good and can be very good-hearted and can be allies to people who are a different race than them, a different religion, a different gender or sexual identity or sexual orientation, a different ability. You can be a good ally to all of those people. But at the end of the day, that is not going to be enough to really bring us to a place of equality and equity until we look at our systems, our structures, and our laws. And so that's where critical race theory came from. And that's how critical race theory has now come into some other areas of our world. So we're going to go deeper into that. That was a brief overview. And we're going to start with Dr. Convertino, because the big question that has come up quite a lot in recent discussions of critical race theory is, how does this play out in the world of education, in both the K-12 world and then at universities and in law schools? So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Convertino to take us to that next level.
Great, thank you, Anne. So again, I'll provide a kind of a brief overview of the significance of critical race theory to education. Critical race theory was introduced into education in the mid-1990s by way of William Tate, Dr. William Tate, and Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. And Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings and Dr. Tate were interested in critical race theory as a way, a theoretical tool to make sense of and to explore the enduring racial inequities in education. So there had been a lot of attention paid to and a lot of theories dedicated to trying to understand discrepancies with regards to gender and socioeconomic class, but there wasn't really a very robust theory for investigating the significance of racialization and racism to racial inequities in education. And so they built on the work of Dr. Bell and Dr. Crenshaw to introduce CRT into education. And pretty much from the inception up to contemporary time, critical race theory in education has been predominantly used by educational researchers. So it's typically taught in graduate courses to either master level students in education or doctoral students in education who are conducting research. And it's used as a really important, robust theoretical tool to explore, like I said earlier, how enduring policies and practices in K through 12 education contribute to these persistent racial inequities in education, and also to advocate for ways to change those. So some examples of areas that have been studied using CRT are, for example, racially segregated schools, the underfunding of schools, disproportionate funding of schools, curriculum that is either racist in nature or silences or marginalizes the experience of students of color, the disproportionate disciplining of students of color, as well as different types of assessment and instruction that reproduce or promote kind of deficit views of students of color, or this idea of inferior intelligence, which is foundational to some of the work that CRT does and tries to correct and address and deconstruct. So I think the main point that I want to underscore is that CRT has been in education for a while, and it has been primarily in graduate education to help us to understand and make sense of these very complex and enduring problems around racial inequities in education. CRT has also can be found in higher education in fields like the humanities and the liberal arts, and that's because those fields, like education, are friendly to or receptive to different ways of thinking about problems. So they're open to different methodologies, different assumptions about the production of knowledge, different theoretical frameworks. And so we see in the humanities interest in the different world views about knowledge, about the production of knowledge, different ways in which knowledge is produced, the importance of experiential knowledge, the importance of the voice and experiences of students of color and people of color. And so in this way, the humanities and the liberal arts have embraced CRT as a way to also engage with different methodologies and different types of knowledge and knowledge production. I guess what I want to say with regards to K through 12 education, in the recent attention that it's been given in the media, is that CRT is not something that is taught typically in K through 12 education. In fact, there's no clear evidence that that's something that is taught, which and so the concern that that is taught is just sort of ill-founded, which doesn't mean that it is not important for students to have have exposure and have curriculum that looks at diverse ideas, diverse experiences. And one of the kind of concerns with this recent fear-mongering around CRT in the context of K through 12 education is the potential that it has to silence K through 12 teachers in engaging their K through 12 students in critical thinking about the history of the US, or about the diverse experiences that make up US history in both history classes as well as other types of K through 12 classrooms. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. I think that also with regards to K through 12 education, I think there was another part to the question that I don't recall right now, but I think the main point is just to underscore that critical race theory is not something that is taught in K through 12 education. It would be actually really useful for it to be taught to pre-service teachers so that they can engage critically with all students and provide a robust education to all students, and work against enduring legacies of educational inequities in schools that have to do with racialization and racism. And so I think that's what I have to say about that for now.
Thank you, Dr. Convertino. I know it's difficult in a short span to cover these really complex topics, but I'm going to turn next to Dr. Reid, because one of the questions that came up is, do we still need this? Does racism still function in society, and how does it still function? And what are the ways that we see this? And I know that this is something that you study, and you also have lived experience. So I want to hear from you next, Dr. Reid.
Well, I'm going to say this, and I mean it in the best way. This is a fight about people. This is a fight about people who look like me, who walk in this space every day, where there's kids, where there's teachers who look like Black and brown people. We need to have these conversations. It's not a matter of if it's important, if it's useful. It's a matter of recognizing the residual impact of slavery and what that means. Oftentimes we don't want to talk about it. Why? Because it's hard. It's hard to talk about things that are real, and it's not shaming anyone. It's just reality. Crenshaw created a theoretical lens, just like Banks did and so many other great scholars, to address the issues that impact everyday lives of people who are impacted by those residual impacts systematically, curriculum-wise, and everything that we do. You don't have a choice but to talk about race. Why? Because if you're teaching kids, how can you not? If you're in higher education settings, how can you not? You don't know where people will go. Microaggressions, which are daily attacks on people of color, they're a part of everything that we do. How do you learn to deconstruct those things without theory, without a theoretical lens that goes from a singular conversation that centers in whiteness and to a multicultural lens where you can see people? It's about seeing people. It's about how we treat people. It's about the impact that we have in every aspect of what we do, period. It has to be talked about. It must be talked about. It's talked about now. And the less that we recognize it, it just makes people, Black and brown people, have that fight. We're in a fight every day. And I guess if you're not walking that fight, you wouldn't know that. There are a lot of different intersecting identities, meaning crosses. When you're in the middle of your world, for example, when I show up in a space, I'm in a predominantly white school that's Jewish, and a parent got up and said, I don't want my kids learning about CRT. He said that because I was there. I know he said it because I was there, because I'm in curriculum and instruction. That's what that matters. It matters that people, whether you're white, Black, brown, whatever color you are, it still impacts all of us. So not talking about it creates a hostile environment for everyone, because the truth of the matter is bigotry does not belong anymore. It's not going to be tolerated. We have to start redefining and reshaping what we do and how we do it. Rather it's through force, meaning policies and procedures like what's going on in New Mexico, or it's through us willingly, creatively and collectively working together. But there is not a question of a matter of if it matters. It's a matter of when you see it, like you have to. It's not a matter of choice.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Dr. Reid. And I think we'll probably come back to talking about things like microaggressions and intersectionality, which was a term also that Kimberly Crenshaw didn't necessarily invent, but brought to the fore.
I know but about it, but it's a matter of understanding, like, what does that mean when you show up with all your different identities into
Right.
spaces that were not built for you, right? Like, let's be honest. That's the residual impact of slavery. We have so many institutions, organizations that are built on one view, one way, one person. And when people of color show up in those spaces, there are clashes, whether we want to talk about it or not. That's the intersection. And those things have to be dissected and deconstructed using critical race theory, using any multicultural lens. Why? Because how can you understand what you're doing if you don't have those theoretical frameworks?
So a perfect example of what Dr. Reid is talking about is the ways in which this theory of critical race theory was recentered on whiteness recently, in these debates. And so it was never meant for that. But now you're hearing people say that it's self-racist because it is anti-white. And so that was one of the questions that we got as well. Is critical race theory anti-white? Is it even about whiteness? And I want to turn to Dr. Ullman next to have her share with us her thoughts on that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horak. So is critical race theory anti-white? The short answer is no. Critical race theory and critical race studies, which is a broader field, aren't about placing blame. Rather, both fields, critical race theory and critical race studies, are fields that offer like a variety of intellectual tools for understanding how it is that racism, specifically in the United States, is embedded in institutions such as the law, public policy, education, healthcare. And actually, the idea of critical race theory putting blame on whites is kind of a reversal. It's a narrative that is just not true. It's a narrative that isn't just untrue, it's the opposite of true. That is, critical race theory doesn't address individual acts of discrimination and prejudice, which is how things like a slave auction at a fraternity are discussed on the right. They're seen as just a few bad apples. Instead, it focuses on understanding the ways that racism operates in systems. And critical race theory tries to account for what it is in our culture, in our social infrastructure, and our institutional shaping that reproduces undeniable inequality, the lived violence and trauma that people of color experience in the US. Critical race theory doesn't look at the individual part, but critical race studies, the broader field, does. And the reality is that things like microaggressions are certainly discussed there. One of the questions that came up was is critical race theory racist? And often people ask, can people of color be racist? And the reality is this: institutional racism is the product of years of white supremacy, and it's designed to produce really far-reaching benefits for white people. And institutional racism carries on in spite of our personal attitudes. It doesn't matter. Thus, there's no such thing as Black institutional racism or reverse institutional racism, because there's no centuries-old, ingrained, normalized system of domination that does that. But if you ask, can people of color be racist? The reality is that interpersonal racism takes place on the ground level. And it's certainly true that members of all different groups can harbor negative attitudes toward other groups. But the reality is that we're talking about two different things. We're talking about systemic racism that works on the institutional level, and we're talking about interpersonal relations, and that's where microaggressions come in. People ask what, and maybe we'll talk more about microaggressions. People also ask, what's white privilege? I love this quote from James Baldwin, who I think of as not only an amazing novelist, but a social theorist. And he said, whiteness is a metaphor for power. And the idea of white privilege is that there are certain social benefits that white people experience that people of color don't. And often white privilege and the social structures that keep it in place, those things are invisible to white people who benefit from it. White privilege acts like a kind of invisible backpack of unearned assets. There are things like inherited wealth, home ownership, things like bank loans, things like not being followed around by a clerk in a store while you shop, things like not being stopped by the police for driving your car, for walking, for running. Racism isn't only individual acts of meanness, cruelty, and violence. It's systems of power and exclusion, and those things are invisible to most white people. It seems natural, in quotes, for Wall Street bankers to be white men and for the people who clean their offices to be women of color. White privilege means that most white people don't have to think about race, about their own race, our own race. It means that we're surrounded by affirmations of our social status and our worth. We have the freedom to move, speak freely, to work, to play without considering whether it's safe or even possible for people like us to do those things. It means things like assuming that white male experiences are universal experiences. It means that when you watch films or other media, they have heroic white characters. It means that you learn about white people in history class. It means that you read books by white authors in school. It means that whiteness is normalized. And it means that people of color are othered, villainized, and excluded. White privilege gives dominance to white people as a group. And that doesn't mean that white people can't be poor. In fact, the majority of poor folks in the US are white because the majority of people in the US are white. But that doesn't mean that their struggles are made worse because of racism. There's this movement right now that's going on against CRT, or against critical race theory, that's happening specifically in school board meetings right now. And maybe to make a link to what Dr. Convertino was talking about earlier with what's happening in K through 12 schools. I can say that in the fall of 2021, right before Trump was defeated, he issued an executive order that banned diversity training and critical race theory in federal agencies. And soon after that, there were bills to ban critical race theory from the military, state legislatures, and a number of states, including Texas, banned critical race theory in public education with the tagline that critical race theory is racist and that it teaches people to hate each other. In reality, critical race theory has become like an empty signifier. It's like a catch-all and it refers to any kind of talk about race and racism at all. There's a highly organized assault on critical race theory, and it's not an expression of hope. It's a cynical ploy to keep power and privilege in the hands of white people. The people who are protesting critical race theory in school board meetings have gotten their playbooks from two groups. They are ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank. These groups have been hosting webinars about critical race theory, and those webinars began the minute Biden was elected. They call critical race theory the new intolerance, or the rejection of the underpinnings of Western civilization, which is sort of ironic because in a way they're understanding that racism is baked into US society as well. They're against any kind of talk, discussion, even a mention to race or racism, except to say that we shouldn't talk about it. And I'll just end really quickly, but right now, there are at least 165 local and national groups that are trying to disrupt or block lessons about race and gender in K through 12 schools. And these groups are really reinforced by those conservative think tanks, media outlets, and even law firms. And they disrupt school board meetings, they campaign to oust liberal school board members, and they harass parents who support teaching about equity issues. And the people who show up at school board meetings to protest critical race theory have been given their talking points by ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and the Heritage Foundation. And many school board members across the country, especially in smaller cities and rural areas, have dealt with harassment, have had to deploy security, and ultimately have had to suspend in-person school board meetings. So that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Ullman. You know, I think that especially the situations that we've seen in school boards just highlights the confusion that is out there, because oftentimes when people are seeking for these bans, they're banning something that just simply doesn't exist in the K-12 world. There isn't a curriculum, for example, in the K-12 world, but they're also banning, you know, what Dr. Reid was talking about. They're banning the teaching of other, and Dr. Convertino, the teaching of perspectives that are beyond just the white perspective. So the idea of normalizing whiteness is the same as the idea of normalizing maleness. And so that all focuses on one group as the base and everything else as the deviation. And one example I use with my students is, you know, if I say to you, What color is the color nude? N-U-D-E, nude. What color is that? And my students will say, well, sort of beigeish, sort of pinkish. Well, why is that's what my skin looks like, but that's not what nude skin looks like on all human beings on the planet. But that is a very simple way of showing how whiteness gets normalized. So nude means what white skin looks like, sort of pinkish beigeish, which is not the skin tone of many, many people across our planet. That's a simple example of how something that was invisible, suddenly you're like, oh, why is it that way? Just like, we can use a million other examples. I want to turn to some of the questions that we're being asked, though, and continue to talk about them, because we have questions around things like what causes racism, and questions around, what guidance do we share to young people who, and all of us teach young people who continue to face racism and experience microaggressions, and are oftentimes told, well, that's just what I'm used to. That's just how it's always been, it kind of excusing this behavior with, well, that's just how I grew up. It was okay when I grew up, so I can say it now. So do any of you have responses to sort of like, where does this racism continue to come from? Or also, like, what do you tell your students who continue to experience it every day?
Can I just say something?
Yeah, absolutely.
Go back to Dr. Ullman. People of color can't be racist. They didn't create the hatred, so they can't be what they didn't create. But we can have biases and, like you said, different dispositions about different races. As to your question, racism is residual to slavery and all the other aspects of us being injustice to people of different races and different spaces. So it's not a matter of where does it come from and why is it still here. It's a part of our everyday because we don't deal with it. We don't face it. And I also wanted to say curriculums for teaching culturally diverse populations have been around since the civil rights movements. We just don't use them. We don't implement them into our practices or mainstream. There are teachers and educators who are out there implementing curriculum that reflects the students that they serve. It's just not mainstream, meaning that it doesn't get, a lot of press or a lot of attention. But the truth of the matter is, to students that I've taught, this year I'm teaching college, but it's the same message. Don't ever get used to someone mistreating you. Don't ever get used to something that's not normal. It's not normal for your voice to be silenced. It's not normal for what you need and curriculum and teaching approaches to be disregarded. A lot of times I would tell students, advocate for the things that make you you, right? Because it's your tuition dollars, it's your body, it's your presence that actually sustains a institute of any nature. So if you're not there, they don't have a system, right? So if you're saying, I want to read something else, say that. If you're saying that I need something that reflects me, you need to say that because it is your right. You are a primary stakeholder in your own education. A lot of times students need to know that it is okay to say that I don't want to read this because it has nothing to do with my lived experience, or I would like to learn more. The more they vocalize their needs, the more teachers and institutional procedures and policies will have to expand to accommodate. So it's a matter of recognizing that you have that right, and also that racism is a part of everything that we do because we don't talk about it, and we don't talk about it in the spaces where every space where it matters, from schools to social to emotional, curriculum. Everything that we do needs to consider, does it represent the population and a diversification of this population, or is it just representing one voice?
Yeah, and the insights that you're making are excellent. And I want to remind everybody who's listening that we have done quite a few of these courageous conversations, and we started one on race after the murder of George Floyd. And we spent quite a bit of time talking in that courageous conversation about the creation of race, about which Dr. Reid was referring to at the beginning of her comments. So these are all on the YWCA El Paso website, and you can go back and look at any of these previous conversations, and I encourage you to do so. That's kind of a question. Another question that we have is, you know, are people, as Dr. Ullman was talking about, you know, sort of, is there a sophisticated weaponization of CRT, and the general public just doesn't know? Well, the general public can find out. You know, you can do your own research and your own learning, and do your own you know, listening and reading and watching of things to better understand these issues, rather than just accepting whatever particular media, you know, you follow. Other people, your response to some of these things that have come up so far.
I'd like to just piggyback on what you just said with regards to the importance of people getting educated about critical race theory, because I think a big part of the current problem is that there's a lot of misinformation circulating, and I think it's purposeful and intentional to confuse folks about what critical race theory is. And so I think it's really, really important that people take the time and get educated on, you know, critical race theory. So I think that's also, I think that's really important. I also think that the current attack on critical race theory is actually, a manifestation, the latest manifestation of racism and racialization in this country. And I think that, and again, it's misinformed. So I think it's really important that people be educated about critical race theory. They be educated about the history of the United States and about the origins of racism, both historically and how that continues to inform current and contemporary forms of racism. And so, yeah, that's just something I wanted to add to the conversation.
Let me jump in and follow you with that. We have a question in here talking about Peggy McIntosh's the Unpacking the Invisible Backpack, which you were kind of referring to earlier, Dr. Ullman, and asking for other resources. And so we are going to kind of compile a list of some other resources that Kayla or the YWCA will send out to everybody who attended today. Some other things that you can read or watch and learn from, because it's a complicated topic. And it's something that, as Dr. Reid and others have said several times, we haven't talked about it enough. And so people sometimes just don't know because it hasn't been talked about. Not talking about a problem does not get us any closer to solving the problem. We have another comment in the questions about, you know, the degree to which the importance of teaching U.S. history. You know, you can love your country and know that your country has a lot of blood on its hands and sins in its background. Okay, I want to go to some other questions that we have. Well, the issue of like, you know, it's an interesting question to talk about racism in our border region. You know, you hear people sometimes say, well, we don't have a problem with that in El Paso. You know, this idea that El Paso is sort of a magical place. I do think El Paso is a magical place in many ways, but it's not a perfect place. And it's a little bit different in the border. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on how critical race theory, that lens, as Kimberly Crenshaw says, it's a way of looking at things. It's not a thing in and of itself, but it's a thing for looking at things. How that lens can expand to talk about other issues like things like colorism that we really see often on our border. Would anybody like to talk about that? Any of the panelists, or other identities?
Sure, I'll talk about that, and then maybe others can jump in. So I think CRT is a really useful and important tool to talk about racism in the context of the border in El Paso, and to talk about colorism, as you indicated. I think that there is a discourse or a view that circulates, a privileging of lighter skin in this community. And, you know, you hear when you see a baby that's born or a little kid, there's kind of a celebration of the lighter skin of that child. And so that is a form of racism that functions in this context. I think language and class are also tropes for racism in this context. And so you hear a lot of kind of critique of, you know, Pocho Spanish, for example, which is compared to more academic or formal Castilian Spanish. And so I think that's a way in which racism functions in this context. And then again, as I indicated, I think class or socioeconomic status is a major way in which racism functions in this context. And so I think it's a useful, you know, there are other iterations of critical race theory, or so we have Lat Crit theory that looks at the experiences specifically of Latinx people and uses more of an intersectional lens. And so it's looking not just at race, but sort of looking at the intersections of race, gender, language, all of these other different factors that contribute to systemic forms of inequities. And so I think those are some considerations in this context.
Thank you. Others, yeah.
Colorism is about denying and or silencing the roots of Africa within every aspect of culture. So it goes back to the same conversation. Why would you care if a baby is white versus black? Well, because what does African blood represent? That representation is what people don't want to talk about. That denial of those roots. In particular in this region, it matters. Why? Because it matters what we identify with as a culture, as a race. Within our Africana Studies courses, that's one of the main things that we talk about. The diaspora, what that means in regards to our identities and how those identities intersect, and recognizing and kind of dismantling that hatred towards Africa and African heritage.
Yeah, I think absolutely a denial of the Afro-Latina Latine population and experience. And to build on what you're saying, Dr. Reid, I also think it reflects the prejudice against indigenous populations. You know, often darker skin is connected, especially in Mexico and Latin America, with indigenous peoples as well as peoples from Africa and from the Caribbean. But what I want us to begin to see, you know, this is how critical race theory is helpful. And once you start talking about something like, okay, race is constructed, but whiteness has been centered, and you can even see it in examples like colorism, because the closer to white you get, somehow the better, right? That's the racist construct that's upholding something like colorism. We do have a question, though, to talk about specifically the experience of Black people on the border. And I, you know, as I said, we hear people say, well, Paso isn't racist, but I have, you know, many Black friends and colleagues and students who have experienced racism on the border, as well as darker skinned members of the Latine population. Would anybody like to talk about how that shows up in a culture that prides itself in being accepting and open? Why does racism still exist here against Black people, against darker skinned people? Who would like to talk about that? I can continue talking.
Well, I think I'll get it started, and then maybe again some people can jump in. So I think one of the reasons that occurs in this context is I think that you know, the white-black binary is the primary construct, the primary way in which racism is thought about in this country and in this context, and so I think that is that construct that needs to be problematized, and so I think that's part of what contributes to that.
There's a comment that's been made I wanted to share because it ties in very much into what Dr. Reid was talking about with South Africa and the surprise that the Omicron variant followed a similar pattern in the US as it did in South Africa, as if it was going to follow a different pattern because we aren't Africa. But I want to build on that comment and say that, many people, when the Omicron variant was first identified, were saying we keep getting these variants from Africa. We have since learned that it did not start in South Africa. It's just that South Africa has such a sophisticated medical system for identifying and classifying variants that they were the first ones who were able to classify it. It didn't begin there. But that, again, is the way racism functions. You think of Africa as this place that bad things come from. And in fact, they're now saying that it might have arisen in Europe. So, all of these automatic thought processes, that's one of the things that critical race theory asks us to do, disrupt them and say, wait, why are people saying that? Why am I thinking that? What is my go-to what is my go-to mentality revealing about how I've been trained by this culture? But we are getting close to the end of time. So the last thing I want to ask the panelists, a question that came through ahead of the panel tonight was, what is the end goal of critical race theory? And I have my own answer to that, but I first want to hear what our panelists have to say. If you were to say, what is the end goal of critical race theory? Who would like to take that first? I'd love to hear all of you.
I just want to say, I think that's a hard question to answer because
Absolutely.
there's no end. The struggle is real. Black and brown bodies, until we stop using people to build upon things in a way in which their voices are not heard. The truth of the matter is it's a fight that's continued. It's not a matter of critical race theory being used for today and gone tomorrow. All the theorists that have been fighting for the justice of Black and brown people in spaces, institutions, organizations. It is a continued fight, and CRT's message is not about an ending, but a matter of us recognizing, seeing, believing, and hearing every voice and putting that voice into everything that we do. So to your question, there really isn't an end until every voice is heard.
I want you to don't go on mute yet, Dr. Reid, because before I turn to Dr. Convertino and Dr. Ullman, there's a question in the chat that kind of picks up on what you were saying earlier and also ties into this ongoing fight. And the question is, can you expand on that self-advocacy in education? Because critical race theory was created by students in Harvard Law working with their professors to say, hey, we're not getting, we're at Harvard Law, the best law school in the country, but we're still not quite getting everything we need. And you were mentioning earlier about students self-advocating. That is part of the struggle. Can you talk more about that?
Just like here with NMSU, where, the Black students said, we don't have programs, we don't have a minor. Keep fighting for the things that actually represent and center the voices of Black and brown people in every circle, every center. And for students, it's a matter of attending those board meetings. For parents, it's a matter of fighting for that curriculum. Because the truth of the matter is, it's their backs that you're building on. The reason why we have schools is because someone attends them. Those someones are those Black and brown faces. So their voices should not be silenced or ignored. And the truth of the matter is, the more they stand, the more things will change. So when curriculum doesn't say what it needs to say, when it's dominating and whiteness, dismantle that. Say, not only will I not read it, but you will provide, because it's there. Why is it there? Because the Civil Rights Act, they happen. It has been around for, we should not still be having this conversation, but we are, because people don't want to take responsibility and turn what they know into action. So I would say to any student, any teacher, any mother, anyone who's in that fight, remember that your voice is the center. And how do you get your centered voice to be heard? Through actionable items. Attend those places where those conversations are still being had, and demand that the curriculum is a representation of curriculum, or practices and procedures are a representation of the things that you need, even when it's difficult.
Thank you. Thank you. Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Reid. That was really powerful. You know, I agree that maybe it's the wrong question. Like, what's the end game of critical race theory? I'm not sure we asked that about theories. And it's a tool, it's an intellectual tool, and we'll keep using it to understand systemic racism. And the reality is that, gosh, we're not, la lucha continua. It's something where, like, it's going to continue. We're all in the struggle. And I just like to mention this idea, and I'll make it really quick, but there's an idea that Gloria Ladson Billings, who's an educational scholar and a Black woman, has talked about, and draws on the work of Derek Bell, but it's this idea of whiteness as property. And the idea is that, like, when Derek Bell looked at the development of the US Constitution, he saw that there was this real tension between human rights and property rights. And the reality is that the purpose of our government in the US was intended to protect property. And the enslaved status of most Black folks, as well as women and children, meant that they were property too. And so the US government was constructed to protect the rights of property owners. And that means that the founders of the US didn't have the incentive to secure human rights for enslaved Black people who were their property. And so I just like to mention this line from Derek Bell, where he said, the concept of individual rights unconnected to property rights was totally foreign to the men who were the founders of the nation. And despite decades of civil rights gains, most Black folks remain disadvantaged and deprived because of this reality. So.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Convertino.
Sure, yeah. So I agree with Dr. Reid and Dr. Ullman about that's not the right question. I think I guess I'm feeling in this moment like there's a big opportunity right now that this conversation is happening around critical race theory, that it not remain in the confines of academia, but that it become part of the public discourse, and that we, actionable item, as Dr. Reid talked about, is to for the public to become properly informed about what CRT is, because as Dr. Ullman pointed out, it is a tool for us to dismantle the legacy of racism, which is the foundation of this country, and which, will continue to just preclude everyone from freedom until this gets addressed. And the how anybody could have any kind of opposition to that, to any opposition to wanting to provide the best education to all students, to protect the lives of all children, like why that would not be a public priority, and whatever we need to do to make sure that that's what's happening. I think that's there is no end.
So I love what you're saying there, because that's kind of the purpose of these things like courageous conversations. We have to talk about these issues, even if it feels uncomfortable. We have to continue to learn and share. Hopefully, as I said, we will share resources with you afterwards. And hopefully just listening to other people lets you begin to ask questions. There are actionable items that you can take. Somebody in the chat was talking about voting. And we know that we have really taken steps backwards in voting rights just today and yesterday in our country and certainly in our state. But you can vote, and you can encourage other people to vote and encourage other people to attend sessions where you learn about candidates. Don't just vote for a candidate because they happen to be aligned with a political party. Learn about them, really learn about them. So there are those actionable items, but you know, when I first saw that question, and I kind of agree, there's not an end goal. It's not a thing. It's a tool. It's a pattern. But the mission of the YWCA is eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. It is a mission statement that many people say, well, that's never going to happen. Well, it's never going to happen if we never think it's going to happen. It's never going to happen if we don't work towards it with real effort and goodwill, not just as individuals, but dismantling the structural systems that keep racism in place and that keep white supremacy in place. I'm on the board, as Dr. Acosta mentioned at the very beginning, of YWCA USA, and we just recently hired our new CEO. Her name is Margaret Mitchell, and she was the CEO of YWCA Greater Cleveland. She's fabulous, and we're very excited about her. And she shared with us, when she thinks about the mission, eliminating racism, she says, you know, it probably isn't going to happen in her lifetime, but what she hopes happens in her lifetime is that racism becomes rare and unacceptable. And that is powerful to me. We need to work together to make it rare and unacceptable. Not something that gets pushed under the rug, not something that gets silenced, but something that gets called out when it occurs so that it becomes less and less frequent. Not less and less frequent because it's getting pushed under the rug, but because more and more people are learning that there is no reason for us to continue a system that holds one group above another group by something as random as levels of melatonin in their bodies. That is not really what we have written down on paper, as Martin Luther King Jr. said. What we wrote on paper in this country was that all men and women are created equal. And until we really see that come to light in every field, in the legal world, the healthcare world, real estate, banking, policing, the military, education, we have not been true to what we claim we want our country to be about. So I encourage you to keep an eye out for those future resources. I encourage you to register for the Race Against Racism on Saturday. There is a virtual option as well. If you wake up Saturday morning and it's just too cold, you can do it virtually. But continue to be a part of these conversations. I also encourage you to follow YWCA El Paso on social media, because that's when you'll find out about things that are upcoming. So any last words from Kayla or Dr. Acosta before we, Kayla has put the registration link in the chat. I think everybody can see that. I do appreciate the questions that you all submitted. And thank you so much to all of my panelists. School just started back for all of us, and so I appreciate you giving your time at a very, very busy right beginning of the semester to join us tonight. So thank you very much to all of you, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Courageous Conversation.
Thank you, everyone.